All right, let's do a quick update on what I've been working on. So the folks who have watched the last couple of videos will know that I've been working on what is basically a data mining startup. I'm going to be starting to basically just collect data that I think can be useful in different ways. That sounds super basic and like not what makes a business. But when I went over this in my video, I can't remember exactly what I called it, but essentially you're sitting on a gold mine was kind of like the gist of the video. And it talks about how building businesses on top of data is kind of what I view to be one of the futures of building businesses in tech. You can do GPT wrappers, you can work on AI models, or you can build stuff on top of data. Everything else to me is going to be automated away. We're not going to get back into it, but you can go watch that video. I'll link it wherever. But right now, I'm focusing on what data can I extract that will be useful for people, and how can I start building applications out around that. So I became kind of interested in the Web3 space when all of the meme coin shit started blowing up. And before you click off of this video, no, I'm not talking about like, let's just build out like a degenerate, like trading thing. What I saw was like a massive amount of data that's available on the Solana blockchain. And the only use that people are putting into it, at least super publicly, is basically fraud. Like that's essentially all anybody's doing with it. They're building snipers, they're building automated bots, all of that. And with all of that data out there and all of that fraud out there, which is clearly causing a problem, like we had like a 26-year-old who rugged the entire country of Argentina, as well as the wife of the current sitting United States president. A lot to be said about that I'm going to leave alone. But there's all of this fraud out there that people clearly want to be at least aware of or able to counteract in some way. And there's all the data out there that at least like 80%, 90% of the data out there that you can use to combat that or to put out intelligence for that. And very few people are doing that. There's like CoffeeZilla, who does most of the analysis, like that he actually works on is like manual. You've got Bubble Maps, which to me at least looks like they're mainly focused on fighting fraud, which is awesome. Really cool tool that I'm going to be looking into some more. And that's basically it. Everything else is kind of built around like a general purpose or like degeneracy. That's pretty much it. Um, so I decided to start building out this Web3 data mining startup. And the idea at first is let's start pulling down transaction data. And I'll show you what that transaction data looks like, at least from a very high level. I'm going to be doing a video specifically on how to parse Solana transactions, because I don't see a ton of material like that out there right now, which is surprising to me. Like there's tons of people doing trading bots to gamble, but very few people are actually doing anything like to actually explain how this kind of stuff works. So let me pop over the screen. This is a Solana transaction that I'm trying to parse. It is an ugly mess of JSON and indexes and log messages and numbers that you've got to go through to figure out what this is. This is a fairly simple transaction made up of 300 lines of JSON that is literally just like a swap. I believe it's a swap on, no, it's a sell on Pump Fund. So this is not useful for anybody. And that's what I was talking about in the last video. A lot of times there's data out there. Like this data is super easy to fetch. It's a single RPC, request, and you're able to grab this data. Super, super easy to fetch that. Not very easy to gather any information out of it. So if you look over at my JSON schema, or at least JSON, my Postgres schema, you can see I'm starting to kind of parse this stuff out. So if we look over at pump transactions, for example, let's view that data. I've got 5,800 pump transactions that are actually parsed out. So we've got things like a unique ID. We've got the timestamp of when I put it in there. We've got the mint for the coin that's being bought or sold. Bonding curve, we'll go over all of that later as I actually learn it. And then the side, which is like a buy or a sell. And then the signature for the actual transaction itself. So that's parsing it out into something that can actually be used. But now it's in like a Postgres row. That's not useful for most people. What most people want to see is they want to see a UI that says this wallet made a transaction with this coin for this amount at this time. That's what they want to see. So all of this data mining stuff really is just like taking data that's accessible but unreadable and transforming it into something that's accessible but kind of readable, and then transforming it into something that people can actually use. And that data distillation is what is kind of key for a lot of these startups. So let's hop over to Excalidraw, and I'm going to explain kind of my general approach as of right now. So right now, let's not even talk about the web3 stuff. Let's talk about just generalized data. So we've got tons of data out there, and we're going to say that it is almost definitely useful. So this data is for some people useful, but for some reason they're not able to get to it. Whether it's too expensive, which is something that I'm not really going to be able to do much for without like funding, or it's just not super readable for people, which is like the case with Solana. So with Solana, there's tons of data out there, but it's very, very difficult to get that data in a format where it's useful. And then it's even more difficult to figure out like, okay, I've got 3 million Solana transactions. There's fraud somewhere. Let's find that. Finding that's when you're actually mining the data. That's when you're looking at this stuff and trying to find patterns. And that's when things get a little bit more difficult. So we've got this data. And what we want to do with this data is actually, I'll make this a little easier. And we're going to build APIs on it. Okay, and all an API is making that data accessible in some way to people outside of me. So API. Okay, so we're gathering all of this data up from different sources. And we'll actually put that somewhere because that's important. Let's just do a circle, and we're going to call that data source. So there's this data source that we're pulling from. In the case of the Web3 startup, it's just an RPE node. And we're gathering that data up into some kind of database. So there's a process of, like, there's processing that happens here. So this is a stage of processing. And this is a stage of processing. So we've got two different stages of processing right here where we're taking data from one form and transforming it into another that's a little bit more readable. So from the data source, which is, let's just say the RPC node, to the data, let's just call it the database. So that is transforming it into a Postgres row that's readable and a lot nicer than that ugly JSON blob. Then this data is being processed again to make it something that's processable by an API. Okay, so that API now is returning much more readable JSON data for the most part. So then what you can do is you can have different applications. And that's going to be what people would traditionally call the business. So you've got app 1, and you've got app, so you've got app 1, app 2, app 3, etc. So this is what people typically call the business. And the reason why I take issue with that is the business is not really that. The business is all this stuff up here. The apps are just like the front end that you put on top of the data. I'm not saying that front ends aren't important. Obviously, that's the part that people actually interface with. So they are important. But pretending like these apps, like these front ends or these applications that you're building on top of your data are the important part, I think that's where people go wrong. The really important part is all of this stuff on the back end up here. Without this stuff, you've got nothing to really present in these apps, and these apps are functionally pointless. So the direction that I'm going is instead of starting here with the application layer, because here you've got another layer of processing where the data is actually going to be presentable in like a UI form. So that's going to be what people actually interact with. Some people will also interact with the API if they're like power users or trying to build applications on top of your data. So that's another thing that can happen. But for the most part, most people are going to be interacting with this UI. They might be building stuff off the API, it kind of depends. But this is another layer of processing right here. This is basically the final layer of processing. Technically, people can use your app to generate reports and other stuff later on down the line. So there's another layer of processing. This can keep going into like an endless stream. But the point is I think the mistake that I made last year in building these businesses is I focused a whole lot on these and very little on this. And I think the gold mine is sitting here when most people are focusing on the apps. Does that make any sense at all? It may not. You can't talk back to me. I don't know why I'm pretending like you can. So right now I'm building out this stuff, all of the data processing, all of the back end. And I'm not even like I've got a couple of ideas of things that I'm going to build here eventually. Like there's actually a proof of concept application that I'm thinking about releasing fairly soon. That is essentially all it's going to do is you give it a CA, which is like a contact address for a particular coin, and you put it in and it fetches the information from there and gives you some kind of readout that could indicate whether or not it's like a bullshit token. So I'm thinking about working on that. I'm not 100% sold that I'm going to release that anytime soon, but it would be very, very easy. I technically have all of the data already available for that. I would just need to build a front end for it. But that's basically where we're at right now. Okay. We are working on the data layer. We're working on the data layer for a data mining startup, which means that's kind of like the most important layer. This does not only apply to Web3. If you're building out something that gathers data on just about anything else, if you're gathering like emails to build email lists for people like to market with or do sales with, you've got to gather those emails and build out a pipeline for gathering those emails. Otherwise, you're basically just like going to have to send emails with emails in them, and that's going to be a super manual process and really ugly. You don't want to do that. You want to build out your data pipeline first and your applications layer. Trust me, from somebody who made the mistake last year and burned a ton of time, you need to do it this way. You need to focus on your data first. And that's what I'm going to be working on over the next several months at least. That's about it. Take it easy. Peace.